A few weeks ago, a parishioner was asking about the factual basis for many of our Christmas carols. The Gospels talk of angels appearing to shepherds living in their fields with their flocks by night and in going to find the child wrapped in bands of cloth and lying in a manger. But in our carols, we hear of drummer boys, snow, whole menageries of animals, and excited casts of characters. Now, I was in a rush. And so I gave a very quick explanation that our carols are based on pious legends, not the Gospels. And this worked for the discussion, but as we listened to the carols this week, I'm reminded of some of those pious legends. You see, we have spent the past 4 weeks building to this moment, to the birth of Jesus, the long-promised Messiah. And when we find a lowly baby in a lowly setting, wrapped up and placed in the manger. And yes, Luke tells us of angels in the sky, and Matthew tells us of the Magi and the star. But all in all, the birth of Jesus seems to have gone unnoticed. God became a human being, and nothing major really happened. And according to the scriptures, yes, Jesus would go on to preach with wisdom beyond his years when he was a little bit older than my Ezekiel. But really, certainly life was not particularly extraordinary. Mark doesn't even talk about it at all. Jesus was poor, but not desperately so. Even while on the road for 3 years, while there was concern raised when they thought they needed to come up with food for 5,000, Jesus and his disciples never really seemed to be that worried about food or shelter. The birth that we celebrate at Christmas is certainly worthy of celebration. Christ was born into this world. The Word became flesh. But for centuries, within the early church, it simply wasn't celebrated. Christmas was not a major feast day, and it was Jesus' ministry, death, resurrection, and ascension which were marked, not his birth. And it's not to say that there was not an interest in Jesus' birth in early years. There are volumes of texts devoted to those early years of Jesus' life, of legends about them. And in those legends, we would find characters that we recognize, such as Anna and Joachim, the parents of Mary, and stories about her betrothal to Joseph. There are also stories of Jesus bringing clay birds to life and both resurrecting the dead and cursing other children with moral consequences that have not been passed down through the centuries. And then, as Christianity spread and encountered the solstice traditions throughout the Northern Hemisphere, as people celebrated the returning light in the midst of darkness, the events portrayed in Luke and Matthew that are best understood as happening in the spring began to be celebrated in those ancient years of the church in these days of darkness. But the pagan stories of the old gods and their exploits in bringing the sun back from the darkness of night were far more engaging than a group of sheep and their tenders finding a young mother, her frightened husband, and a tiny little baby wrapped in a manger. And the pagan traditions that were associated with these stories were similarly much more exciting than the simplicity of commemorating the scene with a religious service. And I recognize that when we hear about snow at Christmas or that Jesus never cried a tear, we are hearing these pious legends and not something from scriptures. And I love both the legends and the scriptures. The legends represent a truth about who Jesus is as the light in the midst of darkness, the most perfect person who has ever lived. But also, the scriptures present a truth that the same Jesus came into the world as a seemingly ordinary baby, in a seemingly ordinary way, to a seemingly ordinary couple. There may not have been snow on the ground, but it was cold enough that the baby needed to be wrapped up. No doubt, as with any child, Mary and Joseph fretted over him, especially in those first few hours, days, and weeks in which babies even babies today are so delicate and their lives seem ever in the balance. At a time when children routinely did not live to see their first birthdays, this would have been even more so. And so, as much as I love the legends with their cast of characters and the magic in the air, I love the prophets speaking of Jesus as the Messiah coming as the salvation of the world. What I love most about Christmas is the ordinariness, how God chose to become human, and the reminder that is Jesus, that that birth brings us to treasure each other as the images of God in this world. From the moments of our births as teeny tiny, scrawny, crying babies to the days when we pass from this life into the next. Amen.